I think there are three challenges that we have to think about, however. First of all, how we characterise learning. I haven't had time to do the research, unfortunately. I was going to this year and then I've just run out of time. I did a bit of a straw poll with 3 or 4 senior leaders that I know. 2 of whom are actually my PhD students. When I was in meetings with them, I said, just out of interest, do you do lesson observation? Yes. Can you define learning for me? What do you mean? Well, how would you define learning? I don't know. Then how can you observe it in a lesson? And I think one of the things that we've got to, or one of the things we can use lesson study for is really opening up a far wider, deeper debate about what learning actually is, what the process of learning is, how people learn in different contexts. To get the same richness in learning discussions as we've had in teaching discussions for really quite some time. As I've already said, that I think there's a real challenge about how we capture the process of learning, and we found that the more methods we use, as long as they're targeted, the better. So we'll do things like leave dictaphones on tables so that we can actually pick up the discussions that kids are having. I was at Andy and Andy's session this morning. One of the things that we have done, not a huge amount of, one of the things that I found really useful as an observer is actually listening to kids talking in a lesson and trying to work out roughly where they might be in solo taxonomy through what they're saying, how they're connecting it together. Is it just bits of disjointed sort of information, or are they beginning to bring it together in the kind of social sort of discussions that they're having? And then how you actually analyse that data, and we're fortunate that we have a linguist on the team who's now actually doing discourse analysis on transcripts, and that is opening up a whole new front of how people are constructing ideas, which I actually, the detail of which I really haven't got a handle on. One possible way of looking at learning is this one by Knud Lerris. He's not very well known. He's a Danish psychologist. This is the sort of theoretical basis that we've been using a lot. And he argues essentially there are 3 dimensions to learning. There's the cognitive, which is obviously hugely important. There's the emotional, and therefore those always work in tandem together within the individual to give you acquisition. So all the stuff about motivation, for example, if you're not motivated to learn, if you're in a really bad temper, then you're probably not going to learn as well. But he also makes the argument that obviously all individuals are actually within a social setting, and therefore there's a social angle on learning as well. And I think there's a lot of really interesting debate. I think cognitive science is incredibly important and gets us part of the way there. I'm afraid I don't believe that cognitive science tells us absolutely everything. And what I think is problematic is that I think our debate of cognitive science has started to close down to certain ideas from certain individuals very quickly. For example, I've started doing a lot of reading around extended theory of mind. So there's one area of cognitive science that would argue, for example, if you've written anything down on a piece of paper, that's part of your long-term memory. Because if you think about how we use our long-term memory, it's ordered, you can retrieve it when you need to, and if you lose it in some way and you can't access that information, well, that's a piece of paper and a pen. So actually, if we say that written notes that we've created isn't part of our long-term memory, is it because they're not, or is it just that we have some preconceived idea of where the mind sits? So there's lots of interesting debates to be had, and I think those are the kind of things that need to be opened up. And again, I'm not saying there's a definitive answer. So, one of my favourite images really, how much learning can we actually see through lesson study? And I would claim lesson study, like any other technique within the classroom, any other technique, action research, I'd argue that lesson study is just a specific type of action research, will give us glimpses. It will give us part of the picture on how learning is happening. We will always have to extrapolate to put the rest of the detail in. And all we can do is by using things like more than one method, really thinking carefully about the kind of data collecting, the kind of theoretical frameworks we're using, is blow a little bit more of that fog away, but we'll never see that landscape on a clear day. We'll always have things obstructing our view of what's happening. So all we can do is use what we can get and use it in the best way possible. But if people are sort of saying, oh, you know, use this because it just shows you everything, complete cobblers, never happened, in my opinion. So where has all of this taken us? Because we've used lesson study, but lesson study hasn't ended up, you know, we don't just do loads and loads of cycles of lesson study and nothing else. This is really just not really to bore you to death with research methods. We're actually completely throwing everything out the window for next year on our master's course and redesigning research methods course completely from scratch. But we want to understand it. So one of the things we're doing, I know people have talked about action research this morning, is now starting to say, well, rather than just using lesson study by itself, why don't we embed it with other approaches to research? So what we're actually going to do this autumn is do an evaluation, do sort of questionnaires, focus groups, interviews with students before they start. Then in one of the sessions, we'll do some lesson study, but then later on we'll go back and we'll get some more questionnaires and interviews and focus groups and do a sort of like a rolling set of cycles where lesson study becomes part of the evidence, not the whole of it. And one of the things I would say within this, because it's where I actually started with all my research way back when I did my PhD, the evaluation is actually going to use focus groups with students to help us actually design the course as we move along. We haven't written the details of this stuff. It's almost like an emergent curriculum. And if you're sort of saying, that's fine because you're working at master's level or adults, the whole of my PhD was actually about working with students to design a GCSE course. We actually developed the curriculum together as we went through it. And actually the results were a damn sight better than they were, certainly in terms of prediction against FFT, for example. So one of the things I'll say to you is don't necessarily just think that lesson study is a panacea, because it isn't. And think about how you could use it alongside other tools to really give you a rich sense, not only of learning, but of curriculum. I just wanted to finish off with where we've got to in terms of thinking about teacher professionalism and agency. Again, the colour bits are a bit small, I understand that, but we are of the opinion increasingly, goes like tick sheets on lesson plans really, on observation sheets really, is that the teacher standards are a bit restrictive. And actually there's some fantastic research by somebody called Jane Green, who makes the point that if you have things like performance management, if you have things like teacher standards, that actually that ultimately can take the responsibility of teachers to be professionals. Because what it means is that they can just operate by mostly numeric targets and tick sheets rather than thinking deeply about what it means to be a professional and developing in a really expansive kind of way. So from our data, and also from just reading around sort of various ideas, we argue that we should start thinking in terms of what we call pedagogic literacy. And first of all, see that as a career-long development. That this is something about people developing their ideas and growing as professionals over a long period of time. And getting sort of politicians to accept that it might take more than 2 or 3 years to create an expert teacher. Put it in a different sphere. I've seen a lot of stuff on Twitter about, you know, expert researchers, teachers as expert researchers. And, you know, you do this in 2 or 3 years. I've been researching on and off for 20 years. For half that time, full time. I wouldn't call myself an expert researcher. I'm a pretty good researcher now, but I'm not an expert. I work with people who are, and the amount of time and effort and reading that has gone into making them expert researchers is massive. So I think we just sort of need to be a little bit careful, and it's a long-term thing. And we argue, we sort of used strands of a rope analogy, the idea that all of these things need to intertwine at the same time. You know, it's not a case of choosing sort of 3 targets every year and sort of working on that. These 5 things need to go together. It's sort of written in a university language, but that's sort of immaterial to a certain extent. So we would argue that we need to have far more focus on the affective foundations of pedagogy and professionals. I think the reason that anecdotally I'm seeing so many people on antidepressants, people leaving, etc., is that the gap between people's values and attitudes and what the system is asking them to do has grown so wide that at a deep level people feel genuinely uneasy about a lot of what they're having to do. So I think one of the things we need to do is begin to see part of being a brilliant teacher being about values, attitudes, philosophies, and giving people the space to realise those. Personal growth, so all the professional skills, classroom management, behaviour management, all the usual stuff. But then, and it's just really an example, understanding through things like pedagogic content knowledge, frameworks for understanding how you put that pedagogy together with subject knowledge, and also how you get the most out of experience and reflection, and not just, you know, let's talk about it for 10 minutes after a lesson and that's reflection done. Genuine debate, of which I think lesson study can be part. Collaborative growth around sort of notions of professional development. This idea of collaborative development and learning. Not always using lesson study, but using opportunities for people to work in groups. And I think where we've had real success with this school that we've been working with 66 teachers is that we convinced the SLT to put some time into it and give them the space to do it. And actually, they reckon they've seen an upsurge in really good teaching and learning as a result. But we also think organisational and societal contexts need to be thought about. That actually part of being a good teacher is sort of having time to get our eyes up above what's going on in the classroom and thinking about social and cultural inequality, thinking about policy and our place in policy, rather than just reacting to it all the time. And also organisational context. One of the things I find with expert teachers is one of the things they're really good at is understanding the micropolitics of the school and how to subvert the systems to create a genuinely good experience. And they're master tacticians at being able to do that. So we would argue that sort of what's coming out of this on a bigger picture is this idea of a more holistic view of people's development. And the reason I use growth, and I've argued this online quite